Good evening, everyone. I'm Todd Wolfson. I'm president of Rutgers AAUP-AFT. And I just want to say at the outset that we're just so happy to have you all join us for the Coalition of Rutgers Unions Fireside Chat. Although, as you can see, at least here, and I don't think Naomi has one either, there's no fire here. So we'll take that for what it is. But before we get to Naomi, who's our amazing guest, I wanted to briefly outline what the Coalition of Rutgers Unions is and how we plan to approach the pandemic together. So the Coalition of Rutgers Unions represents 20,000 unionized workers across the university and the great state of New Jersey. We are the dining hall staff, the administrative staff. We're frontline workers, doctors, techs, nurses, custodial staff, facility staff, grad workers, PTLs, postdocs, full-time faculty. Simply put, we are Rutgers, and Rutgers works because we work. So I think as people have seen in recent weeks, the administration has asked this coalition, all of us, to talk to them about what they're calling shared sacrifice. So in response, I want to lay out the general vision for how the coalition will approach the moment and the concept of shared sacrifice. So for us, the bedrock of our approach is a belief that in this crisis, Rutgers must protect the most vulnerable. Each time we've faced a crisis, whether it's the 2008-2009 housing crisis or even farther back, one consistent theme is that the people who are asked to carry the heaviest load are always the most vulnerable. Shared sacrifice never seems quite so shared. And as a coalition, we stand together to say we must protect the most vulnerable. So that is our compass in this moment. Now, while the university and all of us are clearly in a pretty serious situation, the coalition demands that Rutgers act with moral and political clarity. And that has specific meaning for us. Specifically, that means the administration must not ask our PTLs, our dining facility staff, our grad workers, and specifically our international students, and our frontline healthcare workers to bear the brunt of the financial impacts of COVID-19. That is simply not shared sacrifice. We also believe the university must act as a critical support to the communities where we live and work, from New Brunswick to Camden and Newark and across the extensions. This is how we think the university can lead, and this is how we, the coalition, define solidarity. And there's one other critical thing I want to mark. As the university comes to us to talk about shared sacrifice, we want to call on them to do some simple things. We want to call on them to use their sizable unrestricted reserves to deal with this crisis. We want them to cut back on athletics and prioritize the core mission of the university, teaching and research. And we want them to chop salaries of top earners much more aggressively than they have to date. If they can take these simple and what we think are very logical steps, and alongside protecting the most vulnerable, then they will see the coalition as a ready and willing partner to help weather this storm. Okay, so I know you're not here to hear from me, so I'm going to pivot. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Naomi Klein. Naomi is the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair in Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies here at Rutgers. It was a coup to get her. She's author of multiple books that have certainly shaped how I see the world, and I think how many of us see politics and society, everything including No Logo, The Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, and most recently, On Fire. And I have to say, I'm really lucky because I get to count Naomi as a colleague and as a comrade because she's in the department with me. Tonight, Naomi will talk about how we can fight COVID capitalism. And this will build on our work focused on the shock doctrine and the way elites see crises, like the one we are in, and the way they try to use it as an opportunity to move forward their agenda, whether their agenda is privatizing what are public goods like healthcare and public education, whether their agenda is extending surveillance capitalism and mapping our every move, or whether their agenda is disciplining workers and the working class more broadly. And the question for us, and I hope we really dig into, is if that is how they see this crisis, then how are we going to see this crisis as an opportunity?
Absolutely. Todd, thank you so much. And it's really great to be convening with my wonderful Rutgers colleagues. We don't have a fire for this fireside chat. I did light a candle behind me to have a little bit of fire. But also I think to remind us that this is an incredibly somber, difficult time. It's a time of grieving. It is a time of tremendous pain in this state. Just today, Governor Murphy announced an additional 308 deaths in the state of New Jersey just today. That is more than the state of New York, which means that New Jersey now has the highest mortality rates anywhere in the United States. So we need to keep in mind that the kind of cutbacks that we are talking about are happening against this backdrop of this ongoing emergency, this ongoing both tragedy and travesty of public mismanagement and so many needless deaths. So that is the backdrop against which we are having this conversation. And as Todd said, I'm going to start just by reading a short statement about what is going on right now with our part-time lecturers in the spirit of the principle that we need to stand together. As one of the signatories of COVID-19 Statement of Academic Solidarity, which I hope some of you have seen, I stand in solidarity with Rutgers' 3,000 part-time lecturers who have been targeted for layoffs and work reduction in the midst of a public health emergency and unemployment crisis. According to Howard Bunce's cogent analysis, there was and remains no factual basis for instituting an across-the-board hiring freeze as announced on April 3rd, and even less basis for singling out all PTLs for a 25% budget reduction. This draconian measure will cause significant harm to those already precarious employees while saving the university little money. PTLs teach tens of thousands of Rutgers students every semester and are among its most experienced and dedicated educators. In addition to undermining the economic security of thousands of Rutgers employees in this time of crisis, these layoffs harm students' education. PTL layoffs will very likely lead to larger class sizes, fewer course offerings, and less access to highly trained mentors. And if there is one thing this pandemic is teaching us, it is that a safe future is a smaller scale future, and that includes smaller classes. One of the things that drew me to Rutgers in the first place is its commitment to serving diverse and complex communities, a commitment reflected in its research, in its student body, and increasingly in its faculty. In the midst of a pandemic that preys on pre-existing inequalities, we cannot back down from this commitment. So I call on Rutgers to immediately rescind this premature hiring freeze. I further call on Rutgers to reinstate any PTLs who had a reasonable expectation of employment on April 2nd when the hiring freeze was announced. Finally and urgently, I call on the university to provide any PTLs who lack health insurance with access to Rutgers healthcare clinics during this crisis. Thank you. So I wanted to share that to start off with, and also I just want to share my appreciation for you, Todd, and for the whole union team. This is a very, very good time to be represented by a strong union, and we are tremendously fortunate that we have that kind of representation, and that we're seeing this extraordinary cooperation from different unions at Rutgers, presenting a united front, a united vision, to the university. And of course, we are the university. I think one of the things that's so dispiriting about the fact that we are already seeing these layoffs announced, right, is that we are in a moment that is very, very volatile. It is very much in play, right? Nothing is a done deal. The future that we get is a future that we fight for, right? This is not a moment to accept a logic of austerity, a logic of just sort of quietly accepting that the people who are going to pay for this crisis are the most vulnerable. What we are seeing is unprecedented bailouts for the wealthy, in terms of direct payouts, bailouts, massive loan guarantees and loans directly from the Federal Reserve. But we're also seeing this very unequal economic crisis where there are whole parts of the economy that never shut down, that never slowed down, that never paused, and are in fact amassing huge amounts of wealth in the midst of this crisis, right? So this makes it very unlike 2008, 2009, where you had just an across the board a free fall that affected everybody, including the billionaire class. We now are in a situation where brick and mortar companies are certainly being hit very hard, but you have tech companies that are actually winning windfall profits in the midst of the pandemic and have increased their wealth. The billionaire class as a whole has increased its wealth by 10% during the pandemic by a total of $308 billion. And this is research from the Institute for Policy Studies. And so what that means, among other things, is that these are companies like Amazon, like Google, like Microsoft, that have big interests in education, and they aren't going to lawmakers on their knees. They're going to lawmakers very powerful, very, very liquid, and with a whole pre-existing agenda. So Todd, you asked me to talk about the sort of big picture of disaster capitalism. And of course, we and you are going to be talking more specifically about what this means in our university. And you're the expert on that, not me. What I guess I would just share in terms of that big picture before we go into the specifics is that we're certainly seeing a replay of kind of what I would call like, old school disaster capitalism, of the kind that I've written about again and again, whether in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Maria or after the 2008 financial crisis, where you have this pre-existing wish list of deregulation, low taxes, austerity that gets pushed through in a very predictable manner. And we are seeing this. We're seeing this with a big bias towards polluting industries, which is particularly ironic in the context of a pandemic where preliminary research shows that there may be indeed a very close connection between air pollution, exposure to air pollution, and vulnerability to the virus. And of course, because of environmental racism in the United States, the places that are most polluted and where people's bodies have borne the toxic burden of an economy based on fossil fuels, these are the communities where we are seeing the highest mortality rates, overwhelmingly African-American communities and Latino communities in the United States. So it's particularly outrageous that under cover of crisis, the Trump administration has suspended enforcement of environmental protection laws and regulations. We're also seeing, of course, direct bailouts for fossil fuel companies, for airlines, for cruise ships. So this is the sort of usual thing that we can expect. We're also, Trump since day one has been talking about eliminating the payroll tax, which is a backdoor way of defunding Social Security. So in the midst of this crisis, which is exposing the brutalities of this absolutely inadequate and frayed social safety net, we are in fact seeing a further decimation of that safety net in the form of a tax on Social Security, but also state-based attacks on Medicare and Medicaid. So we've heard about some of that. What I've been focusing and what I've been writing about is a form of the shock doctrine that is higher tech than we have seen before. Now, we did see something similar after September 11th, and Shoshana Zuboff talks about this in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, where she talks about how on September the 10th, 2001, the tech companies were actually really frightened of a push to regulate them in the interest of protecting consumer privacy and increasing concerns about aggressive surveillance. And on September the 12th, all of that was out the window, and it was all about Silicon Valley collaborating with Washington to get at as much information about the public as they possibly could in the name of fighting terrorism. We are seeing something similar now, but on a much, much greater scale. And I think it may have gotten people's attention today and yesterday when Andrew Cuomo yesterday during his pandemic briefing announced a partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to reimagine New York schools, and talked about how Bill Gates is a visionary with all of these ideas about integrating technology into education, and just kind of spitballing, Cuomo said, and why do we have all these buildings? You know, I mean, we're seeing that people can learn from home. The very next day, that being today, Cuomo had a special visitor to his daily briefing, and that was Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google. He left Google as CEO and chairman just about a year and a half ago. And though he still has 5 billion in shares in Google and is still an official consultant to the company, and also is heavily invested in all kinds of other tech companies, what Eric Schmidt has been doing, spending his days doing over the past couple of years, is he has been chairing these two boards in Washington, one about how the Department of Defense can increase its use of AI, and the other, which was created by Congress to advise Congress on greater ways that the U.S. can use technology, particularly AI, in ways to reduce, economic and security vulnerabilities. A very, very big general mandate, which Schmidt has interpreted as a mandate to shake down Washington for many, many billions of dollars in a kind of yellow peril arms race on AI with China, basically saying we are getting crushed because we have these quote unquote legacy institutions, like the idea that we should see our doctors in person, teach our students in person, that we have a financial system that still uses cash and credit cards. We still have these crazy ideas about privacy, and all of that is holding us back, and we're about to be crushed by China. And the only thing that can right this is a massive public expenditure in 5G infrastructure and all kinds of artificial intelligence that can then be privatized by Silicon Valley. And so now what Cuomo announced is that Eric Schmidt is going to be heading up a blue ribbon commission on reopening New York's economy with an eye towards remote learning, telehealth, and working from home, remote work. And it's really a pre-existing wish list that had nothing to do with health, or which was being sold to us as being more convenient, more efficient, and there was a lot of pushback, right? I mean, just like before September 11th, when these tech companies were on the verge of being regulated, it wasn't so long ago that we had presidential candidates running in the primaries promising to break up these tech companies and regulate them. We had New York kicking Amazon out. And now we have Eric Schmidt saying, well, I guess you're happy to have Amazon now because they're the only ones delivering you your packages and your streaming services. So we're seeing definitely a high-tech version of disaster capitalism. It has a lot to do with education. It has, as much as it does with health, which is also a big concern for Rutgers. Basically, this is a push that is treating the way of life that those of us who are lucky enough to have been in our homes over these past almost 2 months now, treating that experience, which most of us did not like very much. I personally don't like it. I personally miss my friends in the outdoors and the outside world. But for these tech companies, they are treating this as a vast living laboratory. Eric Schmidt called it a grand experiment in remote learning. And the idea is to deepen it and keep it going. So I think we need to understand this. I'm calling it the Screen New Deal, hashtag, if you guys like that. And I think it's important for us to, I say this to you looking at you, Todd, on a screen. But look, here's the trouble with the Screen New Deal. It's really goddamn expensive. And as you know, I believe we need a Green New Deal. I think we need it at our universities. We need it at the state level. We need it at the federal level and the global level. And that too is expensive. And the fact is, we aren't going to get any of the things that we need to build an economy and a society that is based on caring for each other and caring for the planet if these big tech companies get their wish list. So we've got to get in there. We've got to fight for the future that we want. We have to fight for the values that we want. We have to say, look, if we need more, if keeping kids home is not the only way to have more social distance in education. You can also have more teachers and smaller classrooms. There are other ways to have more space and elbow room in our cities and in our schools. So that's the kind of, we need to put people back into the equation, because we're very much in a vortex where humans are being kind of erased from the whole discussion, and we're being told that technology can save us, that it can track the virus, that it can teach our kids, that it can cure our ailments, and the rest of it.
I'm just laughing because, so Sebastian, those of you who were on the beginning saw my son, and Sebastian is in first grade, and Philadelphia Public Schools is working with Google. And so he's now thinking of his classroom as a Google classroom. It's like precisely what you're saying is happening, and they're branding it so deeply that it's
Yeah.
perfect. We're going to have Jennifer ask a question, but I'm going to ask one question first, and then actually, no, Jennifer, why don't you start, and then I'll ask my question after, because you're already on. So Jennifer, please introduce yourself, and then please go ahead.
So I'm an intern with New Labor. I have been interning for them for almost a year already. What I have been doing basically is trying to mobilize workers at different places, most likely supermarkets and other places where there are problems such as harassment, wage theft. And I try to not say, well, it is leading them in order for them to fight for their collective rights in having a safe and healthy work environment and being respected. My question to Naomi Klein is, because of all this virus going on, it's definitely putting forth the divisions that we have here, like in social class. Just to say, my experience is that I'm daughter of immigrants and my parents are working every day, as opposed to me, who is home, working from home. And definitely, I'm very worried that this virus has caused the exploitation of immigrants. I want you to go further in that. And in addition to that, how can this be seen as an opportunity in order for many organizations, either locally and at a national level, to work together? And they haven't been seen working together before.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for all your work. And before you said you were with New Labor, I was about to sort of shout out New Labor for doing such fantastic work locally, before the pandemic and during it. Look, I think what we're seeing is a lot of people are seeing this outrageous and untenable tension between the people who are being deemed so essential as laborers that they must work despite huge risks, and in some cases, and this certainly overwhelmingly impacts immigrant workers, being ordered by the President of the United States to go into incredibly unsafe meatpacking plants, overwhelmingly staffed by immigrant workers, in order to safeguard the food supply, as if meat is the only food that people can eat, right? And yet, so simultaneously essential and disposable, and that tension, I think, is something that is being expressed across the board by nurses who are not being given PPEs, by Amazon warehouse workers whose warehouses are not being cleaned, who are getting fired when they stand up for their right to safety and for their coworkers' rights to safety. And so I think the opportunity is in organizing across those sectors, and building on this window of visibility, frankly, for these workers, because capitalism is very, very good at disappearing the people who make our world work in various ways. But in a moment when we are isolated in our homes, and our food is only coming to us thanks to the labor of immigrant farm workers and Amazon warehouse workers and the rest, and mail delivery workers and so on, it is a moment where we can try to close the gap between the essential nature of that work and the way that work is compensated, recognized in our society, right? And so I think that it's, I think we need, and we saw a glimpse of this with the May Day essential worker job action. I think we need that, those kinds of cross-sectoral organizing spaces. And we also need, I think, more solidarity from, we have like the locked in class and the locked out class, right? These workers who, after doing all of this dangerous essential work, are subject to deportation. And so the question is, how are we going to stand up for each other? And I think that we need to have a clearer role for people who are benefiting and consuming from these products. And I think, we've heard some calls now from relatives of workers in meatpacking plants, like for a boycott. I think we need to be having more of those clear calls where points of pressure and points of leverage are applied across the supply and consumption chain. Because my worry is that with this such a high unemployment rate, right, that the Jeff Bezoses of the world are going to be inclined to treat their workforce as even more disposable, right? Because the more desperate workers there are, the more they're going to just say, all right, we can afford to get rid of these troublemakers, fire people who are, whoever we want, because there's going to be more people to take their place. And the only thing that interferes with that, I think, is consumers entering into that equation as well and saying, we're not going to buy your products.
I wonder if we can build on this theme, and then I'll kick it over to Mike McCarthy. But all right, so, and this implicates you a little bit, Naomi. But it builds on the concept of solidarity. It's something we discussed actually recently. So just this week, Tim Bray, the vice president of Amazon, resigned, and he said, quote, in a quote, he quit in dismay at Amazon firing 2 whistleblowers who were making noise about warehouse employees frightened of COVID-19. And so I think what the generation of how this, and you can reflect on this, is that there were some climate justice Amazon workers that came together with warehouse workers to talk about the intersection of climate justice around Amazon, but in particular the problems that warehouse workers were facing from COVID-19. And they were on a town hall with you. And so there are these 2 classes of workers in one case, and then there's a vice president who is dismayed that they were fired and quits. And I wonder, building on what Jennifer said, building on how we as a coalition want to approach solidarity, what does this tell you? How does this tell you and reflect on how we should be approaching concepts of solidarity in this moment?
Well, I think it's a good example of it, right? And yeah, I was, a little bit involved in this story because I've been working with this group of Amazon workers who are called Amazon Workers for Climate Justice. They have been pushing the company for a long time to lower its greenhouse gas emissions. Jeff Bezos kind of talks a good game, like all these tech guys, about caring about the environment and being green. It's an empire built on cardboard boxes. It's not a green company, and they've been sort of calling him out and being a general thorn in his side, making quite a lot of trouble, getting thousands of tech workers, 6,000 Amazon tech workers signed a petition taking on Amazon for its carbon footprint, for doing cloud work, cloud storage work with oil and gas companies to increase their efficiency, calling on them to sever ties with oil and gas companies as clients. And I say this because to point out that they were really making trouble. They testified at Amazon's last AGM. None of this got them fired. What got them fired was when they announced on an internal listserv, or several internal Amazon listservs, that they were going to have a town hall meeting for Amazon tech workers, not for the public, just for Amazon workers, where tech workers, i.e., high paid white collar workers, to hear directly from warehouse workers in the midst of the pandemic, to hear what was going on in the warehouses. And they had invited me to be on that call to talk about the connections between the way Amazon treats the natural world and the way Amazon treats its warehouse workers. And within hours of them posting this, the two key leaders of Amazon Workers for Climate Justice were fired. So there was something about this meeting, this cross-class organizing within a single institution that was far more threatening, right, than the fact that hundreds of them had walked off the job in a climate strike, that thousands had signed a petition, that they had disrupted an AGM meeting with embarrassing resolutions. That's not what got them fired. What got them fired was building that cross-class alliance with the people who really make Amazon work in the warehouses. And I think another piece of it was that they weren't only hearing from warehouse workers in the United States, they were also hearing from Amazon warehouse workers in Europe. And that is also quite radicalizing, because this is a global company that doesn't want its American workers to hear that workers in France have actually won better conditions in workplaces that are exactly like theirs. So I think it also holds an important lesson, I think, for us as people, as education workers, that one of the things that is powerful in a global crisis is to lift up the biggest wins that our colleagues are winning in other parts of the world, because it's rare for people in every part of the world to be experiencing the same thing, not in the same way, but we are all experiencing this pandemic, right? And so if, Milan is opening up its streets to bike lanes and saying we're not going to let the cars back in after this is over in certain, ways, or, in Finland, they're getting a universal basic income, or, whatever it is. This is really important, because there are clearer parallels, I think, in people's minds than there usually are, right? Because it's a common experience.
Yeah, and I think for us, just to reflect back on this and think about the solidarity we're trying to build, hearing from Jennifer and the work that New Labor does, and then hearing just on, the coalition of unions, which spreads again from faculty to, doctors, to nurses, to techs. And that is the kind of solidarity, and holding that up as we step into this next moment, I think is what will make us most powerful. And with that, I sort of want to pivot to Mike McCarthy. And Mike, I'll ask you to introduce yourself. And so at Rutgers, like all over the country, we have not had the kind of PPE we need for our frontline healthcare workers and for many others. And we did a rally, a car caravan, which there's a video which Mike is in the middle of, demanding that Rutgers deal with this problem. But I think there's a lot of questions and issues that emerge. So Mike, I'll kick it over to you to introduce yourself and talk about some of that.
Hey, Mike Gallagher here, CIR SEIU. I'm one of the medical residents working over at Rutgers in Newark. And I was down at that car caravan back, I guess, a couple weeks ago now. So I guess big question for me, kind of especially relevant to the topic of solidarity, is that especially among residents, although I think among a lot of the folks that we're organizing, but specifically speaking in terms of our experience, is that even if we're not necessarily directly retaliated against in terms of firing or hour cuts or something like that by our employer, we are at risk of, future career advancement if our program decides to, say, blackball us if we happen to be too loud of a voice. So, sealed letter of recommendation maybe says, oh, this guy is a troublemaker or something like that, and that makes it hard for folks to get where they feel like they need to go. So I think from an organizing standpoint, one difficulty that we've run into is that people are afraid to put their faces or their names to statements. And I don't know if you have any pointers in terms of building solidarity from that standpoint, or kind of emphasizing the narrative of the union as a protective structure, especially because I think for us, the kind of retaliation that we may face can be kind of clandestine, which I think probably, especially given the expansion of surveillance capitalism generally, will be a bigger thing going forward for everyone, I would guess.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think Todd might be in a better position to talk about some of the protections in place from a union perspective. I mean, because I think as a general rule, the best thing we can do is just build out our numbers as much as possible, right? And I think the letter that I referenced earlier, which is across the universities, the solidarity letter, academic solidarity. I mean, their strategy was getting as high profile academics as possible to sort of front this, right? People who have more job security because of their names, and I think that it is incumbent on those with the most job security, and let's be honest that tenured academics are some of the folks with the most job security. I mean, nothing is complete, but the most job security in our economy, and in a question of like such profound economic precariousness, where more and more people are being thrust into absolute free fall economically right now. How does one use the privilege of that kind of security, right? And if people were saving it for a rainy day, like the rainy day is here. Got your tenure, make some trouble.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But I mean, Mike, the specific question is hard, right? Because I think the question is being placed as an intern and then making trouble. Like, we need to make trouble right now and get people PPE, and then trying to get jobs post internship and being seen making that trouble is what I'm hearing, right? And if that's wrong, please correct. I guess the thing on the table is the union must lead with protecting all its workers. And my experience has been, the more I'm public about my position, the more protected I am. And so I feel like that's true. And I also think what Naomi said is very true, that in this case, in the struggle to come that we have with the university around how to approach the pandemic, while we need to put up front the people who are most vulnerable and their voices need to be lifted up, the people who take the most risks have to be the ones that have the most security. So we need to find a balance between how those of us who have the most security can be the most vocal, while making sure the voices and leadership of folks from New Labor or from other or PTLs, etc., are protected, but their vision is still at the center. And so that's complicated, and it's the work I think we need to do. And maybe we can go from there to Donna, who is also a faculty member with some protections. And Donna, I'm sure you have some thoughts, but thanks, Mike. And Donna, just introduce yourself. And
Hi, everybody. My name is Donna Murch. I teach in the history department. I'm an associate professor, been at Rutgers since 2004. I think this question flows perfectly from what we've been talking about. I was interested in how your story about this resource grab that's going on with the tech industry and K-12 public education, what you think that's going to look like in higher education. And also, I think your point was so important about holding up our biggest wins. So I've been kind of looking at other places that are doing things differently. Canada, for example, is subsidizing graduate students and giving them something like a guaranteed income. So I'm curious about that. How do you think this will play itself out? And I guess we've already spoken to the fault lines that we can organize against this. And one of the biggest ones is this cross-class, multi-union, multi-job category, really with the goal of thinking about how to make the kind of organizing that goes on right now look more like the 1930s and less like the aftermath of 2008, which has in some ways created this enormous right. A lot of the infrastructure was there for it, but because of the nature, I think, of how that crisis played itself out. That's my small question.
Yeah, thanks. No, great questions, and great to see you, Donna. I wish I had this slide at my fingertips. I need to have it for every for every one of these calls. I used it with the Amazon workers and they loved it. But Raj Patel, who's a fantastic expert in food security, teaches at UT Austin. He has an article, I think it was in the Lancet. If anybody can share it, it's an article that just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it is about it's in part a history of the workplace disruptions during the New Deal era, right? And it just has this amazing graph that shows that year after year in the New Deal era, you had more and more major job actions and job strikes. So like the more people got, the more they strike, like to the extent that like the chart just goes like this. In 1937, which you wouldn't think would be a peak year for disruption, was the peak year. And so, I think that's just important for us to sort of understand visually, right? Because often that history is told, as so much a kind of a story of FDR and all of these sort of enlightened, lawmakers, and you just see that it is this huge push from below that is just becoming more and more radical as the New Deal era goes on. And as not radical enough because so many people were left out. So yeah, I mean, I think that looking at what other institutions, what other countries are doing, is absolutely critical when it comes to higher education. And I think your one of your questions was just like, what is this tech agenda going to look like in higher ed? I fear it looks a hell of a lot like what we've been doing. Like like Eric Schmidt did this. He did a video conference with the Economic Club of New York a couple of weeks ago, and he referred to what was going on as a grand experiment in remote learning. And I just thought we were just trying to keep like our shit together, like, I didn't realize this was a grand experiment, but everybody has just, from a Rutgers perspective, we all just sort of dutifully moved our classes online, because we care about our students and we wanted to have some sense of security, and students wanted it. They wanted that sense of security, although my students were very, very clear that they were tremendously disappointed, and that they did not want, that they had specifically decided not to do online courses. They wanted to teach to learn it in person. But I think the sort of, and we all got the kind of kudos, thank you, this is amazing, and we pulled together and we did this, and we did do it, and we should feel good about that. But the reward for that should not be, okay, you showed us that you can do this, now we want, the majority of teaching to be happening online. So I can tell you what Google's vision is. I mean, this is what Schmidt is saying. He's not just talking about, elementary school and high school. He is talking about universities and how institutions can draw on a student body from all over the world, right, without ever leaving. And you can see how that would be appealing to a certain kind of university administrator, the idea that you can have the whole world to choose from your international student body without anybody ever leaving home. And in turn, those students are able to draw on the very best academics, read, a small group who put all of their videos on, all of their lectures on video that get replayed again and again. So this is the vision that we have been fighting since I was an undergrad, like none of it is new. It's just that this is absolutely being seized upon as the opportunity that they've been waiting for. And it's a very unfortunate combination of events where we do have a real threat around physical proximity. Like, it's not like they're making it up and it's not a conspiracy. It is a real thing that we are going to be living with, right? And it is also true that because of the grotesque way that the Trump administration and Congress designed the bailouts so far, the price for this is being offloaded onto the states, onto cities, and it is manifesting very, very rapidly into an austerity disaster a la 2009, right? And this is why I think it is so premature for major public institutions like Rutgers to just say, okay, we're taking this. This is a war. Like, you know, Boeing is in there fighting for their piece of it. And, you know, and there's a battle of ideas. There is a battle of values to be fought. And we need our institution, our state, our elected representatives to fight for the public sphere, you know, to fight for the idea of a public education. Because if they're not fighting, you know, it's over. So yeah, I hope that answers it. I know it's not terrifically optimistic, but that's my read on it. Now, when it comes to the, you know, what's going on in high schools and elementary schools, you know, my son is in second grade, and my real, like, I think that there's a gender component to what's going on, where what is being called remote learning, right, and being celebrated by these tech guys is actually just glorified homeschooling with, like, you know, parents doing tech support for Zoom calls, right? And, you know, this is what Astra Taylor calls photomation, like fake automation. And it's overwhelmingly women who are doing the homeschooling, and that labor is being entirely erased, right? As we call it, remote learning or Google Classroom, right? And meanwhile, the work of an overwhelmingly female workforce, who are the teachers, whose jobs are very much threatened right now, is, as usual, undervalued and at risk. So you have sort of two forms of women's labor that is under attack. As you know, as it is supposedly replaced with technology, but it's not being replaced with technology.
I was going to add just one thing, is that I saw that in the first stimulus package, there was $1 billion for for-profit universities. So just to make your point, that they certainly are lobbying, and we need to.
Yeah.
I think we want to move on. The thing that just comes up for me is, while we face a big uphill battle, there's two things that come up. We have seen an uptick in resistance across the last 10 to 15 years, especially pointed after the 2008-9 crisis. And so, I mean, while we have a lot arrayed against us, I think the other thing we do have is not very strong social movements, but somewhat stronger social movements than we've had in a while in the U.S. And to the degree this is happening, we have somewhat more offensively looking unions, unions like the Chicago Teachers Union, that are, like, putting forward a vision of how to fight back. Certainly a vision that I'm looking to as I think about how this struggle proceeds. And so, and if the university, in this case, to bring this back to home, if the university can't lead in setting a vision, it is our job as a coalition of unions and the workers to take that mantle and to set direction and to fight over that direction. And that, I think, is what we need to do moving forward. If they can't lead in the interest of all of us, we need to show what leading looks like, and we need to set vision that way. And I think part of that is prioritizing.
And we need to unite with other public universities.
Absolutely.
You know,
yeah.
Everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we need to make demands on the federal government, and we need to talk about strategy together, and we need to build that together. And the voices that need to be central to this, one of the critical voices is adjuncts. And so, and I think David Winters, who's on over here, knows a lot about that. So David, maybe introduce yourself, and maybe you could talk about that and what you're thinking, and we could take it from there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Todd. I appreciate it. And thank you so much, Naomi, for being here and for centering the issues of part-time lecturers at Rutgers at this particular moment. There's a history, not just at Rutgers, but across the country, of part-time lecturer and adjunct labor being invisible far too often. We are in the midst of a real existential crisis for every part-time lecturer at Rutgers. Our livelihoods, each and every one of us, are threatened. We've all been made more precarious than we already are. And so I can't tell you how much I appreciate you centering our issues at this moment. My name is David Winters. I'm the vice president of the PTLFC, the part-time lecturer union here at Rutgers. You and I are also in the same department, though we haven't crossed paths yet. I'm in JMS as well. Also, no logo and the shock doctrine are like the first and second reason I left the advertising industry to come to academia. So thank you for that as well. My question is this: you've touched on a number of these points. I want to ask you to kind of drill down into the question of technology a little bit. I'll just take 5 seconds to set this up for folks on the call who aren't aware of this. At Rutgers, the Barchi administration appears to be deploying pretty clearly the typical shock doctrine playbook. They're using this crisis to push policies they've had on their minds for a while, but wouldn't have been able to accomplish without the crisis to provide them with cover. The precarity of our employment status has made PTLs the administration's first target in an attempt to reduce our numbers, restructure our skill set towards online instruction, and increase the amount of teaching done by full-time faculty. You've mentioned a couple times, thank you for this, the relationship between tech and the disposability of academic labor. You've got a lot of experience studying and participating in movements of precarious workers fighting against this kind of playbook. My general question, and then I've got 2 very short specific questions that you can sort of grab onto if you like, is what should PTLs who are organizing and mobilizing at this moment here be prepared for and thinking about as we develop our strategies, given that it seems so clear that the administration is using its tools to take advantage of this crisis. Secondly, how do we push back against the move towards online learning and larger courses? I think we all agree that smaller courses, face-to-face learning is more effective. If that's what we want to fight for, how do we reverse what seem to be overwhelming trends at the moment towards more online learning and towards larger and larger courses, towards fewer and fewer faculty doing more and more work? Should we be thinking about resistance, or should we be thinking about getting ahead of these trends somehow? And finally, along those lines, how do we move from resistance to taking power in this context so that we're not just pushing back, but trying to move forward in a moment that's not just a moment of crisis, but also a moment of opportunity for us?
Well, those are great questions. I think the first one about, what should you be prepared for? I think we've been talking about that in lots of ways, and it's certainly already begun. I think we should all be, I think we really need to be part of the conversation about when and how we go back to work, right? In the workplace, in-person teaching, right? I think that has to be it shouldn't just be an edict where we don't understand the metrics by which this decision is being made. We shouldn't go back to work if we don't feel safe, right? And we also shouldn't be working from home, without understanding why a decision was made not to teach in person, right? Because there is a very real, this is the problem about allowing for-profit companies to treat our public workplaces as a profit center. We can't trust now, because Google's all over this and Amazon, all these companies have declared that they see this as a massive opportunity. We can no longer have any trust when, if Cuomo, or Murphy announces, oh, actually we're not reopening the schools in September. The question will now arise of whether or not that is happening for purely public health reasons, or whether or not there is this pre-existing agenda to do more remote learning. And so that's why they shouldn't be the ones making the decisions. We should, and healthcare and scientists should, and we need to take profit out of this. It's ridiculous. I mean, this is what Cuomo announced today, is that Eric Schmidt, who has $5 billion in Google stocks, is heading up a blue ribbon commission about how to reopen New York and specifically about public education and public health, right? He's in a massive conflict of interest. So we need to be pushing back on all of that. And we need to be saying that the people who have our students' best interests at heart and our elected representatives in our unions have to be part of these discussions, right? So that we can trust the basis on which the decision is being made. So why are we laying off teachers and moving to a situation where we know they're going to have to be bigger classrooms, when one thing we know about this virus is that big is dangerous, right? Big spaces are dangerous. This is where it is spreading. Whereas, you know, smaller scale does reduce risk. Having more space reduces risk. So there are questions about physical space, right? You know, it makes just as much sense to talk about smaller class size and bigger rooms. Let's talk about that. So in general, as a rule of thumb, in terms of resisting the shock doctrine strategy, I've made the argument that we never win simply by saying no. You know, I wrote a book called No Is Not Enough. I've made it the title just so nobody would miss it, you know, and I wrote that book really as a response to having been part of movements that did try to defeat the shock doctrine simply by saying no, whether Occupy Wall Street, you know, or whether the movement of the squares in Europe after 2008. They were very clear, you know, no cuts, no austerity, we won't pay for your crisis. And maybe they made things a little bit less terrible, but they absolutely did not win. And I really believe that part of the reason they didn't win, and it is always about power, but these were huge movements, and these were movements that, you know, were incredibly courageous and broad-based. But what they most often did not have was their own vision out of crisis, right? And so I think that we need to be taking that very, very seriously right now. We can't just say, you know, like we can't pretend there isn't a crisis that we're dealing with, you know, an economic crisis and a public health crisis. And I would add climate crisis, Haya always in the background, not going anywhere. And so we need to have a pathway, a democratically developed pathway and that is credible, that will bring people along.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Naomi. And I think we should really grab onto that we win when we create a viable alternative vision. And our vision is grounded in people. It's a vision that will win if we make it public. So that's the work we have to do all together in the weeks to come and months to come in dealing with this pandemic. And that's the work we will do. So I think with that, we've gone over by 20 minutes, so we want to close it down. First, I want to thank everyone who came out. We know there was some Zoom difficulties, and we're sorry for that, and we'll get better at this. Everyone is trying their best to learn this tech stuff, or what'd you call it, the Screen New Deal, which is not what we want. And sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions tonight. I also want to thank you, Naomi. Thank you so much for being a wonderful comrade and colleague, and for being such a visionary. We are so lucky to have you here at Rutgers. Thank you for everything. And we have an action we're planning that's coming up. I just want to flag it for folks. I don't know the exact time yet. It's on May 16th, and we're working out the details. That will be in, I think, New Brunswick. And so look out for details about that action. And then I just want to flag for next week, we're going to continue our fireside chats, and we're going to have Janice Sodikoff speaking. Janice is an associate professor of anthropology at Rutgers Newark. And Janice is going to talk about zoonotic outbreaks and why they're intensifying and how we can stop them. And I think zoonotic outbreaks are outbreaks that jump from animals to humans. So I'm sorry, we're all becoming experts in new things. So thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you again, Naomi, for joining us.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, everyone. It was fun.
Yes, and we're going to build that strategy.
Naomi.
All right, everyone, have a beautiful night, and let's keep fighting.